I ain't one for telling tales, but what happened to me in the spring of 1873 needs saying, even if folks won't believe the half of it. My name is Sarah Catherine Shaw, though I went by Catherine Wells those months on the frontier, and I reckon I'm the only woman alive who can say she got her revenge with help from something not of this earth. It started with fire. Always does, seems like. The night they burned our homestead outside Topeka, I was gathering eggs in the henhouse when I heard Mama scream. By the time I ran to the cabin, the flames were already licking at the roof, and 3 men on horseback sat watching like they were enjoying a fine show. I knew their faces, even in the firelight. Jake Colter, mean as a rattlesnake and twice as quick to strike. His brother Will, who'd been sniffing around our land for months, making offers Papa wouldn't take. And Samuel Hecht, the land speculator from town who had his fingers in every crooked deal from here to Kansas City. They saw me standing there in my nightdress, clutching that basket of eggs like it could somehow make sense of what I was seeing. Jake tipped his hat, polite as you please. Evening, Miss Shaw. Shame about the fire. These old cabins, they go up so fast. I wanted to scream, to curse them to hell and back, but something in his smile told me I'd be joining Mama and Papa in those flames if I said one word. So I stood there, watching everything I'd ever known burn to ash, while those 3 devils rode away laughing. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of planning and saving and learning to shoot straight. 2 years of following their trail from town to town, always one step behind, watching them ruin other families the way they'd ruined mine. Until finally, I tracked them to Indian Springs, a settlement so new it barely had a name on any decent map. The stagecoach dropped me at Hensley's trading post on a morning when the Prairie was just beginning to shake off winter's grip. Everything smelled of mud and promise, and the sky stretched out so wide it made me dizzy to look at it. I'd been traveling for 3 days. My bones rattled loose from the rough roads, and my traveling dress was so thick with dust I looked like I'd been buried and dug up again. You sure this is where you want to be left, miss? The driver squinted at me from under his battered hat. Ain't much out here for a lady alone. I'm sure. I paid him his fare and shouldered my carpet bag. Inside it, wrapped careful in my spare chemise, was Papa's Colt revolver and 50 rounds of ammunition. I'd practiced with it every evening for months until I could put 6 shots in a tin can at 20 paces. Thank you kindly. The trading post was a squat log building with a covered porch where 3 old men sat whittling and watching the world go by. They looked me up and down with the frank curiosity of folks who didn't see many strangers, especially not women traveling alone. Help you with something, miss? The oldest one had a beard white as winter and eyes sharp as blue steel. I'm looking for work. Heard there might be families hereabouts needing help with children or housework. Might be. He set down his whittling. Where you from? I'd practiced this lie until it came smooth as butter. Ohio. My husband passed last winter, consumption, and I've got no family left. Thought I'd try my luck out here. The sympathy in their faces was real enough. Every frontier town had widows, young and old, trying to make their way alone. It was a common story and a sad one, but it explained why a woman might travel so far from everything familiar. Well now, the old man said, there might be something. Reverend Matthews and his wife, they've got 3 little ones and another on the way. Been looking for help around the house. Good Christian folks, pay fair wages. That sounds like a blessing. And it was. A preacher's family would give me respectability, a place to stay, and a reason to be in town long enough to find my enemies and plan their downfall. Might I speak with them?
Course.
I'm Henry Brennan, by the way. That there's Pete Dunning and Charlie Walsh. We sort of keep an eye on things around here. Catherine Wells, I said, offering my hand. Pleased to meet you. They directed me to the little white church at the far end of the settlement's main street. It wasn't much of a street, just a wide dirt path with buildings scattered along it like seeds thrown by a careless hand. But I could see the bones of a real town in the making. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a small schoolhouse, and a dozen houses in various stages of completion. Folks here were building something permanent, putting down roots in the endless prairie. The church stood on a small rise, its steeple reaching toward the vast sky like a prayer made of wood and nails. I could hear children's laughter from the little house beside it, and for a moment, my heart clenched with longing for something I'd never have. But I pushed that feeling down deep. I hadn't come here for comfort or healing. I'd come for justice. Reverend John Matthews was a thin, earnest man with kind eyes and ink stains on his fingers. His wife Mary was heavy with child and looked grateful when I explained my situation. Within an hour, they'd offered me room and board in exchange for helping with the children and housework. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. "The Lord provides," Mary Matthews said, settling heavily into a rocking chair while her 3 little ones, ages 4, 6, and 8, regarded me with solemn curiosity. "I've been praying for help, and here you are." I smiled and nodded, guilt sitting heavy in my stomach. These were good people, and I was deceiving them. But sometimes good people have to be deceived for their own protection. They couldn't know what I really intended to do in their peaceful town. That first night, lying on a narrow bed in the little room they'd given me, I stared out the window at the star-crowded sky and thought about my parents. Papa, who'd taught me to read and figure numbers. Mama, who'd show me how to make bread rise and tend the sick. They'd been building something too, something those 3 devils had destroyed for profit. I was just drifting toward sleep when I saw the light. At first, I thought it might be a late traveler with a lantern, but it was too bright, too steady. It hung in the air above the prairie like a fallen star, casting strange shadows that seemed to move and dance. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, certain I was dreaming. But when I looked again, it was still there. The light pulsed once, twice, then began to move. Not like a person walking or riding, but smooth and purposeful, as if it knew exactly where it was going. It drifted toward the town, growing brighter as it came, until I had to squint against its brilliance. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it winked out like a snuffed candle. I waited by the window for another hour, but saw nothing more unusual than an all-hunting mice in the moonlight. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a dream, or perhaps some strange reflection of moonlight on clouds. Strange things happened on the prairie. Everyone knew that. The next morning brought my first real test. I was in the kitchen, helping Mary prepare breakfast, when I heard horses approaching. Through the window, I saw 3 riders coming up the path to the church. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Jake Colter, Will Colter, Samuel Hecht. They looked older, harder, but there was no mistaking them. Jake still had that cruel smile, and Will still sat his horse like he owned everything he could see. Hecht had grown a beard, but his eyes were the same pale, calculating blue I remembered. "Visitors," Mary Matthews said, smoothing her apron. "John will want to greet them properly." I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'll see to the children." But even as I herded little Timothy and Sarah into the back room, I could hear voices on the front porch. Jake's voice, smooth as snake oil. "Reverend Matthews? We're new to your fine town, and we wanted to introduce ourselves. I'm Jake Colter. This is my brother Will and our associate Samuel Hecht. We're in the land development business." Land development. That was what they called it now. "Welcome to Indian Springs," Reverend Matthews said. "I'm always pleased to meet new settlers. Will you be staying long?" "That depends," Hecht said in his clipped Eastern accent. "We're looking at opportunities in the area. Growing communities like yours, they have such potential. Of course, development requires vision. And capital." I pressed my back against the wall, fighting the urge to run to my room and fetch Papa's gun. Not yet. I needed to be smart about this, patient. Rushing in like an avenging angel would only get me killed, and then who would speak for Mama and Papa? "Well," the Reverend was saying, "I'm afraid I'm not much of a businessman. But there are plenty of folks in town who might be interested in discussing opportunities with you. Henry Brennan at the Trading Post knows everyone hereabouts." "Much obliged," Jake said. "We'll be sure to look him up." Their spurs jingled as they walked back to their horses, and I crept to the window to watch them ride toward town. They looked prosperous now, well-dressed and well-mounted. Whatever schemes they'd been running the past 2 years had paid off handsomely. Nice enough fellows, Mary Matthews said when I returned to the kitchen. Though there's something about land speculators that always makes me nervous. They see dollar signs where the rest of us see home. Yes, ma'am. My voice sounded steady enough, though my hands were shaking as I reached for the flour tin. Some folks don't understand that land means more than money to those who work it. The rest of that first day passed in a blur of settling into routines. I helped Mary with the cooking and cleaning, played with the children, and listened to Reverend Matthews practice his Sunday sermon. They were easy people to be around, genuine in their faith and their kindness. It made the deception harder to bear. That evening, after the children were asleep and the Reverend was writing in his study, Mary and I sat on the front porch shelling peas. The air was soft and warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jake Colter's smile. You seem troubled, dear, Mary said quietly. Is everything all right? I considered telling her the truth, but how could I explain that I'd come to their town with murder in my heart? That I was planning to kill 3 men and didn't much care if I died in the process? Just thinking about my late husband, I said instead. Some evenings, the loneliness catches up with me. She reached over and patted my hand. I understand, but you're not alone now. The Lord has brought you to us for a reason. Maybe he had at that. But I didn't think it was the reason she imagined. We were just getting ready to go inside when the light appeared again. This time, Mary saw it too. Merciful heavens, she whispered, her hand going to her throat. What is that? The light was brighter tonight and closer. It hovered just above the prairie, perhaps a quarter-mile from the church, pulsing with a cold, white radiance that made my skin prickle. As we watched, it began to move, not toward town this time, but in a wide circle around the settlement. John, Mary called. John, come quickly. Reverend Matthews hurried out, took one look at the light, and went very still. I've never seen anything like it. Could it be a signal fire? Mary asked. Indians, perhaps? No fire burns like that, her husband said. And no Indian would make such a display. It's too deliberate. The light continued its circuit of the town, and I found myself thinking of a wolf circling a flock of sheep, testing for weakness. The thought made no sense. What did I know of lights in the sky? But I couldn't shake it. Other folks had noticed it too. I could see people coming out of their houses, pointing and talking in low, worried voices. Children pressed their faces to windows, and more than one man reached for his rifle. Should we be concerned? Mary asked. Before the Reverend could answer, the light suddenly shot straight up into the star-filled sky, faster than any bird or thrown stone. In seconds, it was gone, leaving only the memory of its brightness burned into our eyes. Well, Reverend Matthews said after a long moment, that was unusual. We stood there for several more minutes, waiting to see if it would return. When it didn't, we finally went inside, but I noticed the Reverend checked the locks on all the doors before retiring. I lay awake long into the night, thinking about that strange light and the way it had circled our town like a predator marking its territory. But mostly I thought about Jake Colter and his companions, and wondered how long it would take them to start their usual schemes. They never stayed in one place long, preferring to strike fast and move on before their victims could organize any real resistance. This time would be different. This time, they wouldn't ride away laughing. The next few days passed quietly. The mysterious light didn't return, and gradually folks stopped talking about it. I settled into my routine with the Matthews family, learning the rhythms of their household and the patterns of the town. I discovered that Henry Brennan was indeed the unofficial mayor, that Doc Fleming was the only real physician for 50 miles in any direction, and that Mrs. Harriet Morrison ran the general store with an iron fist and a sharp eye for troublemakers. I also learned that Jake Colter and his associates had taken rooms at the boarding house run by widow Emma Thornton. They were making themselves known around town, buying drinks at Sullivan's Saloon, asking casual questions about land ownership and local politics. Exactly what I'd expected them to do. On Sunday morning, I sat in the front pew with the Matthews family and listened to the Reverend preach about justice and mercy. His words were meant to comfort, but they only reminded me of the justice that had been denied to my parents and the mercy that Jake Colter would never receive from me. After the service, as folks lingered in the churchyard to visit and catch up on news, I saw my enemies for the second time. They stood near the cemetery gate, dressed in their fine clothes and watching the congregation with calculating eyes. When Jake caught me looking, he touched his hat brim in polite acknowledgement. I nodded back, playing the part of the respectable widow, and felt my fingers itch for the weight of Papa's gun. "Handsome men," Mrs. Morrison commented, following my gaze. "Though there's something about them that puts me in mind of card sharps. Too smooth, if you know what I mean." I did know. Jake Colter could charm a snake into giving up its venom, but beneath the charm lay a heart as cold as winter stone. That evening, as I was helping Mary tidy the kitchen after supper, young Timothy came running in from the yard where he'd been playing with his wooden soldiers. "Mama, there are strange men in our pasture." Mary frowned, drying her hands on her apron. "What do you mean, strange men?" "Tall men with pale faces. They're just standing there looking at the house." Reverend Matthews was already reaching for his rifle when I looked out the window. But I saw no men, strange or otherwise. Just our few head of cattle grazing peacefully in the fading light. "I don't see anyone, Timothy," I said gently. "Are you sure?" The words died in my throat as one of the cows suddenly bellowed in terror and bolted toward the far fence. The others followed, their hooves thundering against the earth, eyes rolling white with panic. Something had spooked them badly. "Stay inside," Reverend Matthews ordered, but he was talking to empty air. Mary had already gathered the children into the back room, and I was reaching for my shawl. "I'll come with you," I said. He started to protest, then nodded. He'd already learned I wasn't the helpless type. We walked out to the pasture together, the Reverend carrying his rifle and me with my hand resting on the small knife I kept in my belt. The cattle had calmed down and were grazing again at the far end of the field, but I could feel something watching us. Not hostile, exactly, but intensely curious. "There," the Reverend said quietly, pointing toward a small rise near the creek. "Do you see them?" I squinted into the gathering dusk and felt my blood turn cold. 3 tall figures stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, perfectly still, perfectly silent. They were too distant to make out clearly, but something about their proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, too thin, like elongated shadows of men rather than men themselves. "Who are they?" I whispered. "I don't know." We watched for perhaps 5 minutes, but the figures never moved. Finally, Reverend Matthews cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Hello there. Can we help you with something?" No answer. The figures remained motionless as fence posts. "This is private property," he called, louder this time. "You'll need to move along." Still nothing. Then, as we watched, the figures simply weren't there anymore. Not walking away, not running. Just gone, like they'd never been there at all. "Did you see?" I began. "I saw." The Reverend's voice was tight. "Let's get back to the house." We walked quickly across the pasture, both of us fighting the urge to look back. At the porch, Reverend Matthews paused to examine the ground around the house, looking for footprints or any other sign that someone had been prowling around. He found nothing. "Mama, were those the strange men?" Timothy asked when we came inside. "We didn't see anyone, son," his father said carefully. "Sometimes shadows can play tricks on our eyes." But I saw the worried look that passed between the Reverend and his wife. They'd seen the figures too, and shadows don't make cattle bolt in terror. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and stared out at the prairie. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light, and I could see for miles across the grassland. Nothing moved except the wind through the buffalo grass, but I had the strangest feeling that something was out there, watching and waiting. I thought about the mysterious light, the strange figures, and the way the cattle had reacted. None of it made sense, but then again, neither did finding Jake Colter and his associates in this particular town at this particular time. Maybe the Prairie was trying to tell me something. Maybe those strange visitors, whatever they were, had come for the same reason I had. Maybe we all wanted justice. The thought should have frightened me, but instead, I found it oddly comforting. I wasn't alone in this fight, even if I didn't understand who or what my allies might be. I was still pondering these mysteries when sleep finally claimed me, and I dreamed of lights dancing above the prairie like angels preparing for war. The summer came on fierce that year, with heat that shimmered up from the prairie, like the breath of some great sleeping beast. I'd been in Indian Springs 3 months by then, long enough to earn the trust of the Matthews family and most of the townspeople, but not long enough to accomplish what I'd come to do. Jake Colter and his companions had settled into their roles as respectable businessmen, and that made them harder to reach than I'd expected. They'd rented a small office above the general store and hung out a sign reading Prairie Development Company. Every day, they held meetings with local farmers and ranchers, offering to buy land at what seemed like generous prices. What the sellers didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the company had no intention of developing anything. They were buying up the best water rights and richest soil, planning to hold the land until the railroad came through, then sell it to Eastern investors at 10 times what they'd paid. I knew because I'd seen them work this same scheme in Kansas. By the time folks realized they'd been swindled, Jake and his partners would be long gone, leaving behind a community robbed of its best farmland and its economic future. But this time, I was going to make sure they never left at all. The strange visitors, for that's what I'd started calling them in my mind, had become a regular sight around town. Never close enough to make out clearly, never staying long enough for anyone to approach them, but always there at the edges of vision. Folks had stopped talking about them much, the way prairie people learned to stop mentioning the wind or the endless sky. They were just part of life now, mysterious but apparently harmless. I wasn't so sure about the harmless part. It was on a Tuesday morning in late June that I got my first real clue about what they might want. I was hanging laundry behind the parsonage when I saw one of them standing near the creek, no more than 50 yards away. This was closer than I'd ever seen one before, close enough to make out details that left me feeling cold despite the blazing heat. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale as milk, almost translucent, and its head was larger than any human head ought to be. But it was the eyes that made my hands shake as I gripped the wet sheet I'd been about to pin to the line. Large, dark eyes that seemed to hold intelligence and purpose, and something else I couldn't name. It was looking directly at me. We stared at each other across the prairie grass, this impossible creature and I felt something pass between us. Not words, exactly, but understanding. It knew why I was here. It knew about the burning cabin and the men who'd laughed as my world turned to ash. It knew, and somehow it approved. Then little Sarah Matthews came running around the corner of the house, chattering about the baby bird she'd found, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. "Miss Catherine, did you see the tall man by the creek?" Sarah asked, tugging on my skirt. "What tall man, sweetheart?" "The one who was looking at you. He had such sad eyes." I knelt down to her level, my heart pounding. "What did he look like?" "Like he was made of moonlight," she said matter-of-factly. "Mama says I have an imagination, but I know what I saw." Out of the mouths of babes. But before I could ask her anything else, Mary Matthews called from the house, and the moment was lost. That evening, as I was helping prepare supper, Doc Fleming stopped by to check on Mary. The baby was due in 2 months, and he wanted to make sure everything was progressing normally. While he examined her, I served him coffee and listened to him talk about the strange things he'd been seeing around town. Cattle acting spooked for no reason, he said, stirring sugar into his cup. Horses refusing to cross certain patches of ground. And yesterday, old Pete Dunning swears he saw a man 12 feet tall standing in his cornfield, but when he went to investigate, there was nothing there but a perfect circle of corn stalks bent flat to the ground. "What do you make of it, Doc?" Reverend Matthews asked. Doc Fleming was a practical man, trained in Boston, with little patience for frontier superstitions. But he looked troubled as he considered the question. "I don't know what to make of it. If it was just one person seeing things, I'd suspect drink or a fever. But it's happening to too many folks, and they're all describing the same basic, well, I hesitate to call them hallucinations." "Maybe they're not hallucinations," I suggested quietly. Both men looked at me, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. It wasn't my place to offer opinions on such matters, but something about these mysterious visitors compelled me to speak. I mean, I continued, this is a big country. There's a lot we don't know about it yet. Maybe there are people, or things, that we just haven't encountered before. You think they're Indians? Reverend Matthews asked. No, I said, more certain than I should have been. Not Indians. Something else entirely. That night, I dreamed of fire again. Not the fire that had consumed my childhood home, but a different kind of burning. A pure, white light that consumed without destroying, that revealed truth instead of hiding it. In my dream, I stood in a field of this strange fire while 3 men screamed for mercy they would never receive. I woke with tears on my cheeks and the taste of smoke in my mouth. The next morning brought visitors of a more conventional sort. A family named Henderson had arrived from Missouri, their wagon loaded with household goods and 3 tired-looking children. They'd come to claim a homestead south of town, part of the continuing westward expansion that was slowly filling up the empty spaces on the map. I was in town buying supplies when I overheard Jake Colter talking to Thomas Henderson outside the general store. Jake's voice carried that familiar tone of friendly concern that I remembered so well. Beautiful piece of land you've chosen, Jake was saying. Good water, decent soil. Course, it's a mite isolated. Might be smart to consider something closer to town, at least until you get established. We like our privacy, Henderson replied, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Oh, I understand completely. Independence is what drew all of us out here. But there are practical considerations. Indian troubles, for one thing. And I hear tell there've been some strange happenings in that area lately. Cattle disappearing, that sort of thing. My blood began to boil. This was exactly how it had started with Papa. Friendly advice, casual warnings, building fear until the victim was ready to sell at any price. What kind of strange happenings? Henderson asked. Hard to say. Probably nothing to worry about. But if you ever decide you'd rather have something closer to civilization, my company would be happy to discuss a purchase. We're always looking for good land for our Eastern investors. I stepped closer, pretending to examine bolts of cloth in the store window while I listened. What kind of price would you offer? Henderson was weakening. I could hear it. Fair market value, of course. Probably more than you paid the government, given how quickly property values are rising out here. The same lie. The same smooth confidence. I wanted to scream the truth, to warn Henderson that he was talking to a snake in gentleman's clothing. But I couldn't, not without revealing my own purpose in Indian Springs. Instead, I made a decision that surprised even me. That afternoon, I borrowed the Matthews buggy and drove out to the Henderson homestead. The family had made camp near a creek while the menfolk started work on their cabin foundation. Mrs. Henderson, a tired-looking woman with prematurely gray hair, was tending a cook fire while her children played nearby. Mrs. Henderson? I'm Catherine Wells. I work for Reverend Matthews in town. She looked up with the wariness common to frontier women meeting strangers. Ma'am, I wanted to welcome you to our community and offer any help you might need getting settled. The wariness softened slightly. That's kind of you. I also wanted to mention something about the men you might have met in town today. The ones from the Prairie Development Company. Now I had her full attention. Yes, my husband spoke with one of them. Seemed like a decent fellow. I'm sure he did. But I knew men like them back in Kansas, and I feel duty-bound to share what I learned there. I chose my words carefully, sticking as close to the truth as I dared. They have a way of making generous offers that turn out to be not so generous after all. And they're powerful partial to pressuring folks into quick decisions. Mrs. Henderson's face hardened. Are you saying they're dishonest? I'm saying it might be wise to talk to some of the longtime residents before making any deals. Henry Brennan at the Trading Post, Doc Fleming, folks who know the true value of land around here. She nodded slowly. We'll do that. Thank you for the warning. As I drove back to town, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I couldn't save my parents, but maybe I could save the Hendersons. It wasn't much, but it was something. That evening, the strange visitors returned in force. I first noticed them during supper, when young Timothy suddenly stopped eating and pointed out the window. "Look, there are so many of them tonight." We all turned to look, and my breath caught in my throat. They stood in a rough circle around the town, perhaps 24 of the tall, pale figures, motionless as sentinels. In the gathering dusk, they looked like ghostly trees or monuments to some forgotten purpose. "Sweet Jesus," Reverend Matthews whispered. "John," Mary said sharply, mindful of the children. But for once, the Reverend's mild profanity seemed entirely appropriate. Never before had we seen so many of them, and never had they positioned themselves so deliberately. It looked like they were standing guard. "What do they want?" Mary asked, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "I don't know," her husband replied, "but I intend to find out." He started toward the door, but I caught his arm. "Wait. Let me go first." "Catherine, you can't." "I think they know me," I said, remembering that moment of understanding by the creek. "I think they've been trying to communicate." Before anyone could stop me, I stepped out onto the porch and walked slowly toward the nearest figure. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I felt no fear. Whatever these creatures were, they meant no harm to innocent people. I was certain of that now. The figure I approached was taller than the others, its elongated form radiating a strange sense of authority. As I drew closer, it turned its large, dark eyes toward me, and again I felt that wordless communication pass between us. Images flashed through my mind. The burning cabin. My parents' screams. Jake Colter's cruel smile. But also other images, other families, other towns, other schemes that had left good people ruined and broken. I saw a vast web of corruption and greed that stretched across the frontier, and I understood that these beings had been watching it all. They were here because of men like Jake Colter. They were here because someone needed to stand against the darkness. They were here to help me. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a deep sense of rightness, as if puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place. I wasn't alone in my quest for justice. These mysterious watchers shared my outrage at the evil that men could do. "What do you want me to do?" I whispered. The answer came not in words but in more images. A building in town, the office where Jake and his partners worked, documents hidden in a safe, evidence of their crimes spelled out in contracts and correspondence, and 3 men who would finally face justice for all the lives they destroyed. When the vision faded, I found myself standing alone in the gathering darkness. The figures had vanished, but I could still feel their presence, like a benediction on the prairie wind. I walked back to the house on unsteady legs, my mind reeling with what I'd experienced. "Catherine." Mary Matthews rushed toward me, her face white with fear. "Are you all right? You just stood there for the longest time, not moving, not answering when we called." "I'm fine," I managed. They're not going to hurt anyone." "How can you be sure?" Reverend Matthews demanded. "Because they're here to stop the people who do hurt others." The next few days passed in a blur of normal activities overlaid with extraordinary purpose. I continued my duties with the Matthews family, but part of my mind was always focused on the task the visitors had shown me. I needed to get into that office above the general store. I needed to find the evidence that would expose Jake Colter and his associates. But how could a woman alone, with no legal authority and no allies except mysterious beings that might not even be real, accomplish such a thing? The answer came from an unexpected source. I was in Sullivan's saloon on Friday evening, delivering a meal to old Charlie Walsh, who was laid up with a broken leg, when I overheard a conversation that made my pulse quicken. "Don't like the way they're pressuring folks," Henry Brennan was saying to a group of men clustered around a corner table. "The Henderson family, the Williamses, 6 others. Always the same story. Generous offers that turn into demands, friendly advice that sounds more like threats." "But what can we do?" asked Tom Sullivan, the saloon owner. "They haven't broken any laws that we know of." "Haven't they?" Doc Fleming leaned forward, his voice low. "I've been asking around, sending some letters back east. That Prairie Development Company doesn't seem to exist anywhere except on their office sign." "You think they're running some kind of swindle?" Brennan asked. I think they're exactly the kind of land pirates we've all heard stories about. Buy low, sell high, and leave communities bare. If that's true, Sullivan said, we need proof. Something we can take to the territorial authorities. I set down Charlie's meal with shaking hands and moved closer, pretending to wipe down nearby tables while I listened. Proof's the problem, Doc Fleming said. Whatever they're doing, they're smart enough not to leave evidence lying around where honest folks can find it. Maybe evidence could be found if someone knew where to look, I said quietly. The men turned toward me in surprise. Women didn't usually involve themselves in such discussions, especially not in saloons. Begging your pardon, ma'am, Henry Brennan said politely, but this isn't really a woman's concern. I finished. Tell that to Mrs. Henderson, who's scared to let her children play more than a few feet from their wagon. Tell that to Mrs. Williams, whose husband can't sleep for worrying about the threats they've been receiving. The men exchanged glances. They hadn't realized the pressure campaign had escalated to threats. What kind of threats? Doc Fleming asked sharply. The subtle kind. Reminders about how dangerous it can be living so far from help. Comments about accidents that befall families who don't have neighbors nearby. The sort of things that sound like concern but feel like warnings. How do you know this? Brennan demanded. Because I make it my business to know. And because I've seen their kind before. I took a deep breath and made a choice that would either save this town or get me killed. I know where they keep their real business records. And I know how to get them. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the tick of the clock behind the bar. Finally, Doc Fleming spoke. That would be burglary. No, I said calmly. That would be justice. That night, after the Matthews family was asleep, I sat by my window and watched the prairie. The mysterious visitors were out there, I knew, waiting and watching. Tomorrow night, if I had the courage to go through with my plan, I would need their help. As if summoned by my thoughts, a soft light appeared in the distance. Not the brilliant, pulsing radiance I'd seen before, but a gentle glow that somehow conveyed encouragement and support. I wasn't alone in this fight. Whatever these beings were, wherever they'd come from, they understood the difference between justice and vengeance. They knew that sometimes good people had to take extraordinary actions to protect their communities from evil. Tomorrow night, Jake Colter and his associates would learn that their crimes had finally caught up with them. And if I was very lucky, I might live long enough to see them pay for what they'd done to my family. I fell asleep planning burglary and dreaming of justice, while strange lights danced across the prairie sky like angels preparing for Judgment Day. The plan we hatched that night in Sullivan's saloon was simple enough in its telling, though I knew the doing would be considerably more dangerous. Henry Brennan had a key to the general store. Mrs. Morrison trusted him to check on things when she was away, and the office above was accessible through an inside staircase. Doc Fleming would keep watch from his clinic across the street, and Tom Sullivan would make sure Jake Colter and his associates stayed occupied with whiskey and card games until well past midnight. What they didn't know was that I had other allies in this venture. Allies they wouldn't understand or believe if I tried to explain. The next day crawled by like molasses in January. I went through the motions of my daily routine, helping Mary with the housework and minding the children, but my thoughts were fixed on the coming night. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see Jake Colter riding up to the parsonage with a gun in his hand, somehow having discovered what we intended. But the day passed peacefully, and as evening approached, I felt the familiar weight of Papa's Colt revolver tucked into my waistband beneath my shawl. I'd been carrying it for weeks now, waiting for the right moment. Tonight, one way or another, that moment would come. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that nearly derailed our plans entirely. I was hanging wash behind the parsonage when I saw a familiar figure approaching across the prairie. Will Colter, riding alone, his horse lathered with sweat as if he'd been riding hard. I ducked behind the clothesline, my heart pounding, and watched as he dismounted near the front porch. Through the flutter of drying sheets, I could see him clearly, older than I remembered, with lines of cruelty etched deeper around his eyes, but unmistakably the same man who'd sat his horse and watched my world burn. "Afternoon, Reverend," I heard him say as John Matthews appeared on the porch. "Well, Colter, from the Prairie Development Company. Might I have a word?" "Of course, Mr. Colter. Though I should mention, I'm not really the man to talk to about business matters." "Oh, this ain't about business." "Not directly. It's about your hired girl, Catherine Wells." My blood turned to ice water. Somehow, he'd figured out who I really was. "What about Miss Wells?" The Reverend's voice carried a note of protective concern that warmed my heart even in my terror. "Well, sir, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I've reason to believe she ain't who she claims to be. See, I knew a family named Shaw back in Kansas had a daughter looked mighty similar to your Miss Wells. Course, that girl died in a fire some years back, along with her parents." "That's quite a coincidence," Reverend Matthews said carefully. "But I fail to see." "The thing is, Reverend, there's been some accusations made about that fire. Rumors that it wasn't as accidental as it seemed. Now, if that Shaw girl somehow survived, and if she came out here with revenge on her mind, well, that could put your whole family in danger." I pressed myself against the back wall of the house, my mind racing. Well, Colter was clever. I'd give him that. He was trying to turn the community against me before I could expose their crimes. It was exactly the sort of manipulative tactic they'd perfected over years of swindling honest folks. "Mr. Colter," the Reverend said, his voice taking on the firm tone he used when disciplining the children, "I've known Miss Wells for months now. She's been nothing but helpful and honest with my family. If you have specific accusations to make, I suggest you take them to the proper authorities." "Oh, I intend to, Reverend. I surely do. Just wanted to give you fair warning to keep your wife and children close tonight. No telling what a woman consumed with thoughts of revenge might do." Through a gap in the sheets, I saw Will Colter tip his hat and remount his horse. As he rode away, I noticed he took the road toward town rather than back to their usual haunts. He was going to warn his partners, maybe change their plans for the evening. I had to get to Henry Brennan immediately. "Catherine?" Mary Matthews called from the back door. "Is everything all right out there?" "Yes, ma'am," I managed, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "Just finished with the washing. That man who was here, John, said he was asking questions about you." I turned to face her, and she must have seen something in my expression that confirmed her fears. Her hand went to her throat, and her eyes widened. "You are the Shaw girl, aren't you?" she whispered. "The one whose parents died in that fire." There was no point in lying anymore. Will Colter had destroyed my cover as surely as if he'd ripped the mask from my face. "Yes," I said quietly. "My name is Sarah Catherine Shaw. And those 3 men from the Prairie Development Company are the ones who murdered my parents." Mary's face went white, but to her credit, she didn't faint or start screaming. Instead, she stepped closer and lowered her voice. "What are you planning to do?" "What needs doing? Tonight, we're going to get the evidence that will see them hang for their crimes." Some of the men in town. They've figured out what Colter and his partners really are." Mary was quiet for a long moment, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she considered this information. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "John needs to know. And the children should be taken somewhere safe, just in case. Mrs. Matthews, Mary, I never wanted to bring danger to your family. If you want me to leave—" "Don't be foolish," she said firmly. "Your family now, Sarah Catherine Shaw. And family stands together when trouble comes calling." The simple acceptance in her voice nearly brought me to tears. For 2 years, I'd been alone with my grief and my need for justice. Now, when everything was about to come to a head, I found myself surrounded by people who cared what happened to me. Within an hour, arrangements had been made. The Matthews children would spend the night with the Hendersons, whose homestead was far enough from town to be safe from whatever violence might come. Mary would stay with Mrs. Morrison above the general store, where she could be protected but still close enough to help if needed. And Reverend Matthews, despite his wife's protests, insisted on joining our little band of amateur lawmen. "John, you're a preacher, not a gunfighter," Mary pleaded. "I'm a shepherd," he replied quietly. "And sometimes shepherds have to protect their flock from wolves." As darkness fell, I made my way to the trading post where our group was gathering. Henry Brennan was there, along with Doc Fleming, Tom Sullivan, Reverend Matthews, and 3 other men I knew only by sight. They looked up as I entered, and I could see the questions in their eyes. "It's true," I said without preamble. "My real name is Sarah Shaw. Jake Colter and his partners burned my parents' cabin in Kansas 2 years ago, with Mama and Papa still inside. They did it because Papa wouldn't sell them our land." The silence that followed was heavy with anger and determination. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Henry Brennan asked. "Because I came here planning to kill them myself. I thought that was the only justice my parents would ever get. And now," Doc Fleming's voice was gentle but probing, "now I think maybe there's a better way. A way that might save other families from going through what mine did." The Reverend nodded approvingly. "Justice serves the community. Revenge serves only the individual." "Pretty words, preacher," said one of the men I didn't know well. I thought his name was Carter. "But what happens if they get away? What happens if their money and connections let them slip through the law's fingers?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with myself. Men like the Colter brothers had been gaming the system for years, using bribes and threats to escape consequences for their crimes. "Then we make sure they don't get away," I said simply. As we finalized our plans, Tom Sullivan reported on the situation at his saloon. Jake and Will Colter were indeed there, along with Samuel Hecht, but they seemed nervous and were drinking more heavily than usual. Will had returned from his visit to the parsonage in an agitated state, and there had been considerable whispering between the 3 men. "They know something's up," Sullivan said. "Question is, are they planning to run, or are they planning to fight?" "Either way," Henry Brennan said grimly, "we need that evidence. Without it, they can just deny everything and move on to the next town." The plan remained the same, though we now moved with the knowledge that our enemies were alert to danger. Doc Fleming took his position across the street from the general store, watching for any sign of trouble. Sullivan returned to his saloon to keep an eye on our quarry, and the rest of us prepared to break into the Prairie Development Company office. The night was thick with humidity and the promise of storms. Heat lightning flickered on the horizon, and the air felt charged with electricity. As we made our way through the shadows toward the general store, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by more than just Doc Fleming. The mysterious visitors were out there somewhere, I was certain of it. I'd felt their presence growing stronger all day, like a gathering storm that hadn't yet broken. Whatever was about to happen, they would be part of it. Henry Brennan's key turned smoothly in the lock, and we slipped inside the darkened store. The familiar smells of coffee, leather, and dry goods surrounded us, oddly comforting in the midst of our dangerous mission. We picked our way carefully through the cluttered aisles toward the staircase, guided by the faint light of a heavily shielded lantern. The office door was locked, as expected, but Brennan's lock-picking skills made short work of it. Within minutes, we were inside the cramped room, spreading out to search through desks, filing cabinets, and the various papers scattered around. What we found was even more damning than I'd hoped. The ledger book I'd glimpsed earlier was there, documenting years of fraud and violence across 3 territories. But there were also letters, correspondence with corrupt officials, detailed plans for intimidation campaigns, and most shocking of all, a list of problem families that included not just the Shaws but dozens of others who had stood in the way of the Prairie Development Company's schemes. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Reverend Matthews as he read over one particularly vicious letter describing plans to remove obstacles to a land deal near Dodge City. "They're not just swindlers. They're killers." "Professional killers," Doc Fleming corrected, having abandoned his watch post to help with the search. "This is organized, systematic. They've been doing this for years." The safe in the corner remained locked, but the documents we'd found were more than sufficient to hang all 3 men several times over. As Henry Brennan carefully packed the most damning evidence into his satchel, I found myself staring at the entry about my parents' deaths. Shaw property, Topeka. Acquired through fire, no cost. Resold to Railroad Consortium for $15,000. $15,000. That's what my parents' lives had been worth to these monsters. "Miss Shaw, Sarah, we have what we need," the Reverend said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Let's get this to the authorities before." His words were cut off by the sound of boots on the stairs outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that could only belong to one group of men. "They're coming," Doc Fleming whispered, drawing his pistol. "How many?" Brennan asked, extinguishing the lantern. "3, I think. Maybe more." I pressed myself against the wall beside the door and drew Papa's Colt. In the darkness, I could hear my heart hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since the night I watched my world burn. The door burst open, revealing Jake Colter silhouetted against the dim light from the stairwell. He held a shotgun in one hand and a burning torch in the other, his eyes scanning the darkened room with predatory intensity. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of cruel amusement. "If it isn't our mysterious widow and her friends. Out for a little midnight shopping, are we?" Behind him, Will Colter and Samuel Hecht crowded into the doorway, both armed and clearly ready for violence. "Jake Colter," I said, stepping into the torchlight with my gun trained on his chest. "Been a long time." His eyes widened as recognition dawned, and a slow, evil smile spread across his face. "Sarah Shaw. I thought you looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place you. You've grown up some since that night in Topeka." "Not grown up enough to forget what you did to my parents." "Your parents were stubborn fools who wouldn't take good money for worthless land. What happened to them was their own fault for refusing to be reasonable." The casual dismissal of their deaths, the complete lack of remorse, sent fury coursing through me like wildfire. Behind Jake, I could see Will and Samuel spreading out to block any escape route. They'd come prepared for a fight. "You burned them alive," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "I burned down an empty cabin. If they were too stupid to get out in time, that's hardly my problem." Jake's smile widened. "Though I have to admit, your mama made the prettiest screams I ever heard." That last comment nearly broke my control entirely. I felt my finger tighten on the trigger, felt the familiar weight of the gun in my hand, felt the sweet promise of revenge singing in my blood. It would be so easy to end his life right here, right now. But then I remembered Mary Matthews' words about families standing together and Reverend Matthews' distinction between justice and revenge. These men needed to pay for their crimes, but they needed to pay in a way that would protect other innocent families. "Where are the rest of your records?" I asked. "The safe, what's in it?" Jake laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "Wouldn't you like to know? Tell you what, little girl. Put down that gun, and maybe I'll let you and your friends walk out of here alive." "I don't think so." "No? Then how about this? Drop the gun, or Will here puts a bullet through your preacher friend's head." I glanced sideways and saw that Will had indeed moved to cover Reverend Matthews with his pistol. The Reverend stood calmly, his hands at his sides, showing no fear despite the deadly situation. "You're making a mistake, Colter," Henry Brennan said from the shadows near the filing cabinet. "Half the town knows we're here tonight. You kill us, and you'll have every man in Indian Springs hunting you before dawn." "Half the town, you say?" Samuel Hecht spoke for the first time, his cultured Eastern accent making the threat sound almost civilized. "How interesting. Perhaps we should burn the whole town then. Wouldn't be the first community that had to learn the cost of opposing our interests." The casual way he talked about massacring an entire town made my blood run cold. These weren't just criminals, they were monsters who saw other human beings as obstacles to be removed. "You're insane," Doc Fleming said from his position near the window. "We're practical," Jake corrected. "And we're very good at what we do. Now, Miss Shaw, sorry, Miss Wells, you have 10 seconds to drop that gun before we start killing your friends. Starting with the preacher." I looked around the room, calculating odds and finding them grim. Even if I could shoot Jake before Will killed Reverend Matthews, that still left Samuel Hecht and possibly other accomplices downstairs. And even if we somehow won this fight, Jake was right about one thing: they could always burn the town and move on to their next hunting ground. That's when I noticed the temperature in the room beginning to drop. It was subtle at first, just a slight chill that made me shiver despite the summer heat. But within seconds, the air became noticeably colder, and I could see my breath beginning to fog in the torchlight. Jake noticed it too, his eyes darting around the room with sudden uncertainty. What the hell? The window behind Doc Fleming exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. The thing that came through wasn't human. It was tall and pale and moved with fluid grace that no earthly creature could match. Its large, dark eyes reflected the torchlight like mirrors, and when it spoke, its voice seemed to come from inside my head. "Justice," it said without words. "Finally, justice." Jake Colter screamed, actually screamed like a terrified child, and stumbled backward against the far wall. His torch fell from nerveless fingers, rolling across the floor and setting some scattered papers ablaze. "What is that thing? What the hell is that thing?" More windows shattered as additional figures flowed into the room. They surrounded Jake and his associates like pale, impossibly tall shadows, their dark eyes fixed on the three men with unmistakable judgment. The temperature continued to drop until frost began forming on the inside of the windows. Colter had turned his gun toward the nearest figure and was pulling the trigger frantically, but the bullets passed through the creature without effect. Each shot was followed by a dry click as his weapon ran empty, and the being he'd been trying to kill regarded him with what I could only describe as disappointed patience. Jake, what are those things?" Samuel Hecht's cultured voice had risen to near hysteria. "How should I know?" Jake's own voice had cracked like an adolescent's. "Shoot them. All of you. Keep shooting." But their weapons were useless against beings that existed only partially in our world. I watched, fascinated and terrified, as more of the mysterious visitors materialized from the shadows. The small office was now crowded with at least a dozen of the tall, pale figures, all of them focused on the three criminals with unwavering attention. "Sarah Catherine Shaw," the voice in my head said, "your parents' deaths have been witnessed. Their killers stand before you. What would you have us do?" I looked at the three men who had destroyed my world, now cowering together like children afraid of monsters under the bed. For 2 years, I'd dreamed of this moment, planned for it, lived for it. They were completely at my mercy, and I could end their lives with a word. But looking at them now, pathetic, frightened, reduced to their essential cowardice, I found that simple revenge wasn't enough anymore. "I want them to face justice," I said aloud. "Real justice, where everyone can see what they've done and other families can be protected from them." "This is wise," the voice replied, and I felt approval radiating from all the assembled beings. "Justice serves all. Revenge serves only one. But justice must be complete. These men have committed crimes beyond your knowledge." Images flooded my mind then, not just my parents' deaths, but dozens of other atrocities. Families burned out of their homes. Children orphaned by deliberate accidents. Women widowed by carefully staged confrontations. An entire Cherokee settlement poisoned because they wouldn't abandon land that contained valuable minerals. The scope of the Colter gang's crimes was staggering. "They have killed 47 innocents over the past 8 years," the voice continued. "They have destroyed hundreds of lives for profit. Their greed has spread like a poison across your frontier." 47, I whispered, the number hitting me like a physical blow. "Your parents were among the most recent. But if these men are not stopped permanently, there will be many more." The figures moved then, surrounding the three criminals with purpose that was almost ceremonial. Jake, Will, and Samuel found themselves unable to move, held in place by invisible bonds that were stronger than iron chains. Their eyes remained wide with terror, but their mouths could no longer form screams. "What's happening to them?" Henry Brennan whispered. He and the other men had pressed themselves against the walls throughout the supernatural confrontation, staring at the impossible beings with the stunned expressions of men whose understanding of the world had just been shattered. "Justice," I said simply. "The kind that can't be bought or corrupted." "They will remember this night," the voice told me. "They will remember their crimes and their victims. They will confess when the authorities question them, compelled by truth they cannot escape. Every detail, every name, every hidden grave, all will be revealed. And then they will pay the full price for what they have done. But first, there are others who must be found. These three are not the entire conspiracy. More images flashed through my mind. Faces of men in expensive suits sitting in Eastern offices, railroad executives who paid for clearance services, corrupt territorial officials who looked the other way in exchange for bribes. The Prairie Development Company was just the tip of a much larger and more sinister operation. Will you help us find the others, Sarah Catherine Shaw? Will you be our voice among your people as we work to cleanse this corruption? The question hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation combined. I thought about my parents, lying in unmarked graves because their killers had never been properly brought to justice. I thought about the Cherokee families who had been poisoned, the widow in Kansas whose husband had been murdered for his water rights, the dozens of other victims whose names I'd seen in the ledger books. Yes, I said without hesitation. Yes, I'll help you. Then we are bound together in this purpose. But first, these three must be properly dealt with according to your laws. The figures began to move the paralyzed men toward the door, their forms becoming more translucent as they prepared to transport their prisoners. But before they disappeared entirely, the voice spoke to me one final time. Do not fear for their escape or their connections. Justice has been witnessed by powers that no earthly corruption can touch. They will hang for their crimes, and their deaths will serve as a warning to others who profit from innocent blood. Then they were gone, taking Jake Colter and his associates with them. The office was suddenly warm again, and the only sounds were the crackling of small fires where the dropped torch had ignited scattered papers. Sweet merciful Jesus, Reverend Matthews breathed, moving to stomp out the flames. What just happened here? Justice, I said, though I was still trying to process what I'd experienced myself. Something that's been a long time coming. Doc Fleming was examining the shattered windows with the methodical attention of a man trying to make sense of the impossible. The glass is melted in places. Melted, not just broken. What kind of force could do that? The kind that comes from beyond our understanding, Henry Brennan said quietly. He was still holding his satchel of evidence, though after what we'd witnessed, human documentation seemed almost beside the point. As if summoned by our voices, Tom Sullivan came pounding up the stairs, his face flushed with exertion and confusion. What in God's name happened here? He demanded, taking in the destroyed windows and scattered papers. I saw lights, strange lights, and heard all kinds of commotion. Where are Colter and his men? Gone, I said simply. They won't be troubling anyone anymore. Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he studied my face. Gone where? And what do you mean they won't be troubling anyone? They didn't just vanish into thin air. Before I could answer, we heard shouts from the street below. Rushing to one of the intact windows, we looked down to see Sheriff Morrison and several deputies standing around three men who lay motionless in the middle of the main street. Even from our elevated position, I could recognize the still forms of Jake Colter, Will Colter, and Samuel Hecht. Are they dead? Doc Fleming asked, already reaching for his medical bag. No, I said with certainty I couldn't explain. They're alive. And when they wake up, they're going to have a powerful urge to tell the truth about everything they've ever done. We made our way downstairs and out into the street, where a crowd was gathering around the three unconscious men. Sheriff Morrison looked up as we approached, his weathered face creased with confusion. Damnedest thing, he said, touching his hat brim in polite acknowledgement of my presence. Found them lying here not 5 minutes ago, arranged neat as you please. No sign of how they got here, no sign of struggle. Just here. Doc Fleming knelt beside Jake Colter and checked his pulse, then examined his eyes with a small light. They're breathing normally. Pulse is steady. Looks like they're just sleeping, but I can't wake them up. Should we take them to the jail? One of the deputies asked. Might as well, Sheriff Morrison replied. At least until we figure out what happened to them. As the deputies loaded the unconscious men onto a wagon, I caught sight of movement at the edge of town. Three tall figures stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, watching the proceedings with what seemed like satisfaction. No one else appeared to notice them, and when I blinked, they were gone. Jake Colter and his associates woke up in their jail cells the next morning with no memory of how they'd gotten there, but with an overwhelming compulsion to confess their crimes. They talked for 18 straight hours, providing details of murders, arsons, frauds, and conspiracies that stretched back nearly a decade. Sheriff Morrison had to send for additional deputies just to take down all their statements. Within a week, territorial authorities had arrived to take custody of the prisoners and begin the complex process of unraveling the criminal network the Colter gang had described. The evidence we'd gathered from their office, combined with their detailed confessions, painted a picture of corruption that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. The trial was held in the territorial capital that autumn, with newspaper reporters from as far away as Chicago covering the proceedings. I testified about my parents' deaths, and when Jake Colter saw me in the witness stand, he broke down completely, sobbing about the tall ones and begging for forgiveness he would never receive. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on all charges. Jake and Will Colter were sentenced to hang for multiple murders. Samuel Hecht received life imprisonment for his role in the conspiracy, though his health failed rapidly in prison, and he died within 6 months of sentencing. But the most remarkable thing about the trial was how it led to the exposure and arrest of dozens of other conspirators. Every name the Colter brothers had mentioned, every corrupt official they'd described, every businessman who'd paid for their services, all were tracked down and brought to justice with an efficiency that amazed even seasoned lawmen. It was as if some invisible hand was guiding the investigation, ensuring that no guilty party escaped and no evidence was overlooked. I stayed in Indian Springs through that winter, helping Mary Matthews with her new baby daughter and watching the town prosper as word spread about the victory over the land pirates. The Henderson family and others who had been threatened decided to stay, confident now that their community could protect itself from such predators. But I also found myself having strange dreams during those long winter nights. Not nightmares about the past, but visions of the future. I saw other towns, other communities threatened by corruption and greed. I saw families like mine, standing on the edge of destruction, with no one to help them fight back against overwhelming odds. And in those dreams, I saw tall figures standing guard in the darkness, waiting for someone brave enough to stand up for justice. Spring came early that year, and with it, a decision I'd been putting off for months. I was sitting on the parsonage porch one evening, watching the prairie turn green with new grass, when Reverend Matthews joined me. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Soon," I admitted. "There's something I need to do, people I need to help." "The teaching position is still open," he said gently. "Mrs. Morrison still thinks you'd make a fine addition to the ladies' auxiliary. And there are several young men in town who'd be honored to call on you." I smiled at his kindness. "You've all been wonderful to me, but I can't stay. Not when there are other families out there facing the same evil that destroyed mine." He nodded, understanding more than I'd expected. "You're talking about those beings we saw that night, the ones who took Colter and his men, among other things. And they've asked you to work with them?" I looked at him in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because I've been having dreams too," he said quietly. "Dreams about justice and judgment, about standing against corruption no matter the cost." I think they spoke to all of us that night in different ways. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the endless prairie stretch toward the horizon. Finally, the Reverend spoke again. "What will you tell people? About what you're doing, I mean. The truth, as much as they can handle. That there are people out there who prey on the innocent, and someone needs to stand against them. And if they don't believe you, then I'll show them the evidence. Make them see what's really happening to their communities." He nodded slowly. "It's dangerous work you're taking on. More dangerous than letting evil go unchecked." The night before I left Indian Springs, they came to me one final time. I was alone on the prairie, having walked out to say farewell to the endless grassland that had sheltered me during my quest for justice. They materialized from the starlight like thoughts taking form, more of them than I'd ever seen before. Their leader, if that's what he was, spoke to me with the same wordless voice I remembered from that night in the office. "You have chosen well, Sarah Catherine Shaw. The corruption you helped expose was but one strand in a web that spans your continent. There are many more like the Colter brothers, and few like you willing to stand against them. What exactly are you? I asked. Where do you come from? We are watchers. Guardians, you might say. We have observed your species for many generations, hoping to see wisdom overcome greed, justice triumph over corruption. Too often we have been disappointed. But not always?
No.
Not always. There are humans like you who choose the difficult path, who risk everything to protect the innocent. You give us hope for your kind. I thought about that for a moment, watching the stars whirl overhead in their eternal dance. Why do you care what happens to us? Because corruption is a disease that spreads beyond the boundaries of any single world. What begins with the murder of a family for their land can grow into the destruction of entire civilizations. We have seen it happen before on other worlds. We hope to prevent it from happening here. The implications of what they were telling me were staggering, but somehow I wasn't surprised. After everything I'd witnessed, the idea that there were other worlds, other civilizations, seemed almost natural. Will you help us, Sarah Catherine Shaw? Will you be our voice and our hands among your people? For as long as I'm able, I said without hesitation. For as long as there are families who need protecting. Then we are bound together until your death or ours. Go now, and know that you are never alone in your struggles. When you have need of us, we will come. The next morning, I climbed aboard the westbound stage with my few possessions and Papa's gun hidden in my traveling bag. But I also carried something else, the knowledge that somewhere among the stars, beings of incredible power and wisdom watched over the innocent and waited for humans brave enough to join them in the fight against evil. As the stage rolled west toward Colorado and whatever future awaited me there, I thought about the letter I'd received the previous week from a woman named Elizabeth Crandall in a town called Silver Creek. Her family was being threatened by men who wanted their mining claims, and the local sheriff was either bought off or too frightened to help. It sounded like a job for the Prairie Development Company's successors, and that made it a job for me. I was Sarah Catherine Shaw, daughter of murdered parents and seeker of justice. But I was something else now, too, a partner in a cause greater than revenge, greater than any single human life. Behind me, Indian Springs faded into the prairie distance, but I knew the town would prosper. The mysterious watchers would see to that, just as they would watch over me in the battles to come. And somewhere in the vast sky above, carried on winds that blew between the stars, I thought I heard the sound of my parents' voices, finally at peace with the knowledge that their deaths had not been in vain. The fight for justice would continue, but now it would be fought with allies whose power stretched beyond the boundaries of any single world. Evil might wear many faces and speak with many voices, but it would never again go unchallenged while I drew breath. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, full of promise and danger, and I rode toward both with equal anticipation. There was work to do, and I was ready to do it.